I told you 3 times, old man. This terminal's for people with tickets. Not for whoever wanders in off the curb looking for a warm chair. Son, I'm just waiting on my ride. It'll be here any minute now. I promise I'm no trouble. Your ride. Sure, out now. Before I put you out myself. A low roar growing, rattling the tall glass windows. An aircraft, close, landing, officer. Take your hand off that man. This doesn't concern you, pal. Who do you think you? General Marcus Webb. United States Army, and that gentleman in the torn coat is the reason I'm standing here alive. Step away from him. They looked at him and saw a torn coat, 78 years old. A dark green overcoat patched at both elbows, one small tear at the hem he would never let anyone fix. Worn shoes, a slow, careful walk. A quiet "thank you, ma'am," for a door somebody barely held. To the guard at Bramwell Regional Airport, he was a nuisance. A shabby old man taking up a chair. Nobody in that terminal knew that for 30 years, this man had been the steady heart of an entire battalion. That hundreds of frightened kids had made it home because of him. That somewhere, a 4-star general kept his phone number under one word: Anchor. Nobody knew that on the worst night of a scared young private's life, this old man had held him and whispered, "I've got you. Just keep breathing." They threw him out into the cold. And 20 minutes later, a military jet dropped out of the sky and landed just for him. But to understand why, you have to go all the way back. Sweetgum was a speck of a town, tucked in a bend of red dirt road where the pines came right up to the back porches, and the whole place smelled of resin and rain. Isaiah Coleman was born there in a house his grandfather built with his own hands, the youngest of 6, in a family that had almost nothing but had it together. His father drove a delivery route 6 days a week. His mother took in laundry and cooked for 2 churches, and never, in Isaiah's memory, sat down before everyone else had eaten. They were poor. But Isaiah didn't learn that word until school, when a boy pointed at the patch on his knee and laughed, and Isaiah came home confused because at home, a patch wasn't a thing to be ashamed of. At home, a patch meant somebody loved you enough to sit up late fixing what was torn. That was the first lesson Sweetgum gave him. And it would run through his whole life like a thread. His grandmother was the one who raised the children while the parents worked, and she was the quiet, steady center of Isaiah's whole young world. Everyone called her Mama Zell, short for Roselle, a small woman with hands like worn leather and a voice like a slow river. She had a rocking chair on the porch and a Bible on the table so read through. The cover was soft as cloth, and a saying for every trouble a child could bring her. When Isaiah came home crying about the boy who laughed at his patch, Mama Zell pulled him up into her lap, even though he was getting too big for it, and rocked him a while before she said anything at all. "Baby," she finally said, "let me tell you something about people who laugh at a patch. They're looking at the wrong thing. A patch doesn't mean you're broke. A patch means you're kept. Somebody looked at what was tearing and decided you were worth the mending." She tipped his chin up. "You are worth the mending, Isaiah Coleman. Don't you ever let anybody tell you differently. And when you grow up, you go be the kind of man who does the mending for other folks. You hear me? That's the whole job. That's the whole reason we're down here. We mend each other." Isaiah was 9. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood mending. And he never let it go. Mama Zell taught him the other thing, too. The thing that would one day make grown soldiers weep at the sound of his name. She taught it to him without a single word. She taught it by staying. When Isaiah got the fever the bad winter, he was 7, and the doctor was 2 towns over and slow to come. Mama Zell sat by his bed 3 days and 3 nights and did not leave. When his older brother Caleb broke his leg falling out of the tall pine and screamed the whole way to the county hospital, it was Mama Zell who rode in the back holding his hand, saying, "I've I've got you the whole ragged way. When a storm took the roof off half the house, and the family huddled in the one dry room, terrified, it was Mama Zell who lit a lamp and started to sing, low and steady, until the fear went out of the room like water down a drain. She stayed. She always stayed. That was the whole of it. Isaiah watched a small old woman face down fever and blood and storms with nothing but the decision to not leave, and something in him, young as he was, understood that this was the bravest thing he had ever seen, braver than any soldier in any story. The simple, unglamorous, world-holding courage of a person who stays. He decided, without deciding, to be like her. He grew up tall and slow-moving and easy to underestimate. He wasn't loud. He wasn't quick with a joke. Teachers sometimes mistook his quiet for slowness and let him sit at the back and forgot him. But the other children didn't forget him because Isaiah Coleman was the boy who noticed. He noticed the kid eating lunch alone and sat down beside him. He noticed the little ones crying at the bus stop and walked them home. He noticed, always, the person at the edge of the room that everyone else had stopped seeing, and he went and stood with them. He was 17 when his father's heart gave out on the delivery route, and the family's small world tilted, and there wasn't money for the things there suddenly needed to be money for. Isaiah looked at his grieving mother and his younger cousins, and did the math a poor boy does, and one gray morning he walked into the recruiting office 2 towns over and signed his name. Not for glory. He'd tell you that himself, 60 years later. Not for the uniform or the flag or any grand idea. He joined so he could send money home. So his mother could keep the house his grandfather built. That was all. A boy from Sweet Gum, mending his family the only way he could reach. And the Army. The great, loud, hard, indifferent machine of the Army got the surprise of its life. Because it turned out that everything Mama Zell had built into that quiet boy on a porch in Sweet Gum was exactly what a frightened young soldier needs at 3 in the morning, 10,000 miles from home. Isaiah wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the strongest. He was never going to be the one whose name got shouted in the stories. But within a year, the drill sergeants noticed something they couldn't quite name. The scared kids, the homesick kids, the ones about to quit. They all seemed to end up next to Coleman, and they all seemed to make it. He'd find them. That was the thing. Some 18-year-old sitting on the edge of his bunk at 2 in the morning, shaking. Sure he couldn't do this. Sure he'd made a terrible mistake. And Isaiah would just appear, quiet as anything, and sit down beside him and not say much at all. He didn't lecture. He didn't tell them to toughen up. He just stayed. He'd sit there in the dark with a scared kid until the worst of it passed, and somewhere in there he'd say the thing that 100, then 200, then 300 soldiers would carry for the rest of their lives. "I've got you," he'd say, low and steady. "Just keep breathing. That's all you have to do right now. I'm right here. Just keep breathing." They rose through the ranks around him, the loud ones, the ambitious ones, and Isaiah rose too, slower, steadier, one honest step at a time, corporal, sergeant, sergeant first class. And everywhere he went, the same thing happened. Units he joined got closer. Soldiers under him didn't just perform. They held together. In the places where holding together is the only thing that keeps people alive. By the time he made command sergeant major, the highest an enlisted soldier can climb, the senior enlisted leader of a whole battalion, the one every officer leans on and every private looks up to. Isaiah Coleman had become something the Army doesn't have a medal for. He'd become the heart of every place he served. The one they all came to, the steady center. The man who stayed, his soldiers across the years, gave him a name. Not to his face, mostly. Behind his back with love, they called him the anchor. Because in the storm, he was the thing that held. He was the reason the ship didn't drift onto the rocks. Drop the anchor, and you could ride out anything. He served in hard places. There was a valley, the Sargun, they called it, where his battalion spent a long, bad deployment and where a lot of very young people learned things about fear that no one that age should have to learn. Isaiah walked those nights, literally walked them, bunk to bunk, post to post, a big quiet shadow moving through the dark, checking on his kids. He never slept much. He'd tell you an old man doesn't need much sleep. The truth is, he couldn't rest while any of his people were awake and afraid. There was a boy that deployed. Everyone called him Rabbit on account of how startled a 19-year-old from some flat, cold state up north who came apart a little more every week. Isaiah didn't wait for Rabbit to fall. He just started showing up. He'd find the kid on the wire at the worst hour, the hour before dawn when the whole world feels like it's ending, and he'd lean on the sandbags next to him and talk about nothing at all. Fishing, his grandmother's cornbread, the right way to season a pot of greens. He never once said you're doing fine or toughen up. He just stood there in the dark, being a warm, steady, unhurried human being next to a scared one, until the scared one remembered he was human too. "How do you do it, Sergeant Major?" Rabbit asked him once, near the end, when the worst had passed. "How are you never scared?" And Isaiah laughed. Low, that river of a laugh. "Son, I'm scared every single night out here. Everyone. I just decided a long time ago that being scared and leaving are two different things. You can be scared, you can't leave. So I won't leave." He clapped the boy on the shoulder. "And neither do you. Look at that. Still here. Both of us. That's the whole victory, Rabbit. Some nights still being here is the whole victory." Rabbit went home, got married, named his first son Isaiah, though the sergeant major wouldn't learn that for 20 years, at a reunion, when a grown man walked up with a photograph and couldn't finish his sentence. That was the anchor. Over and over, for 31 years. He never counted them. He couldn't have told you a number if you'd asked. He just kept showing up in the dark, next to whoever was closest to the edge, and staying. And it was in the Sargon, on the worst night of that whole deployment, that Command Sergeant Major Isaiah Coleman met a terrified 18-year-old private named Marcus Webb. We'll come back to that night. It matters more than any other night in this story. For now, know only this. Whatever Isaiah Coleman gave the Army over 31 years, the Army gave him something back that mattered more than rank. It gave him a family, 100 strong, scattered across every base and every state and every walk of life. Soldiers he'd sat with in the dark, who grew up and became sergeants and officers and mechanics and teachers and fathers and mothers, and who never, ever forgot the big, quiet man who'd told them to just keep breathing, but the Army takes too. And when Isaiah finally hung up the uniform after 31 years and went home, home wasn't sweet gum anymore. The old house was long gone. His mother had passed, and his brothers and sisters had scattered, and the town had folded up around its one blinking light. Home, now, was a small brick house in the city of Bramwell, on a quiet street, with one person in it who made it home, Odessa. He'd married Odessa in the middle of it all. A woman with a laugh like a screen door slamming and a spine of pure iron, who had raised their life mostly alone through all those deployments and never once made him feel small for the leaving. Odessa was the only person on earth who got to take care of him. The anchor, it turned out, had his own anchor, and her name was Odessa Coleman. And when he came home for good, she looked at this big, tired man who'd spent 3 decades staying for everyone else. And she said, "All right, soldier, sit down. It's your turn to be held for a while." And here is where the coat comes in, because Odessa was a mender. Like Mama Zell. Like every woman who'd ever loved somebody poor. And Isaiah had this coat. A heavy, dark green wool overcoat he'd bought secondhand the first winter he was home, plain and warm, and nothing special. And over the years, as it wore, Odessa mended it. A patch at the left elbow, one winter. A patch at the right next. A reinforced seam. A button matched as close as she could find. Every autumn, when the cold came back, Odessa would take that coat into her lap by the lamp and go over it, stitch by stitch, muttering at it, loving it. Another patch, she'd say, another winter. Lord Isaiah, this coat has more of my thread in it than the factories by now. Then it's a better coat than it ever was, he'd say, and she'd swat him and smile. Another patch, another winter, year after year. Odessa passed 4 winters before this story. Quietly in the spring, with Isaiah holding her hand, saying the only thing he'd ever known how to say to someone he loved who was afraid. I've got you. Just keep breathing. He said it until she couldn't anymore. And then he sat with her a long time, the way Mama Zell had taught him, because you do not leave. You stay, even then, especially then. The autumn after she was gone, the cold came back, and Isaiah took down the green coat and found the last patch her hands had ever sewn. A small one, at the hem the winter before she died. And that same season, the hem tore again a little, right beside her stitching. Everyone told him to get it fixed. His pastor, his neighbor, the kind woman at the church clothing drive who offered him a fine new coat for free. Isaiah always said the same thing, gentle, final. No, thank you. That tear's got the last of her thread right next to it. A man doesn't mend over the last thing his wife's hands ever made. He just wears it, torn and all, that way she's still keeping me warm. So he wore a torn green coat everywhere, torn and all. And that is the coat, and the man that Officer Bryce Keller looked at on a cold gray morning in the Bramwell Regional Airport and decided was trash stop for 1 second, and put yourself in that torn green coat. You gave 31 years. You carried hundreds of scared kids home. You buried the love of your life, and all you've got left of her is the thread in your hem. You've never once asked the world for anything, and now a man half your age is standing over you, calling you trash, telling you to get out. Do you argue? Or do you keep your dignity and just hold on? Hold that thought. The reason Isaiah Coleman was sitting in the Bramwell Regional Airport that gray morning was that his family had come, looking for him. Not his blood family, his other one. For 4 years, since Odessa died, Isaiah had lived quiet and alone in the little brick house. He answered the phone when his old soldiers called, and they did call more than he ever expected, checking on the anchor. But he never told them how the house echoed now. He never told them about the empty chair, or the way he still set 2 cups out some mornings from pure habit before he caught himself. He was proud. He'd spent his life being the one who took care. He did not know how to be the one who needed it. But soldiers notice things. It's what he taught them. And one of them had noticed. One of them, now grown into one of the most powerful men in the entire United States military, had spent 4 years quietly aching over the fact that the man who'd saved him was growing old alone, and had finally quietly arranged to do something about it. That's all Isaiah had been told that morning, that an old friend from the service wanted to see him and would send a plane to a little airfield near Bramwell to bring him for a visit. Isaiah had almost said no. He hated fuss. He hated being flown anywhere like he was important. But something in the voice on the phone, a young officer, an aide, warm and insistent, had made him say yes. "They'll pick you up at Bramwell Regional, sir," the aide had said. "General aviation side. Someone very important is coming to get you personally. Please, sir, just be there." So Isaiah put on his green coat. He got there early, the way an old soldier always gets everywhere early. And because the small general aviation building was locked up tight until the flight's arrival window, a shuttle driver had kindly dropped him at the main commercial terminal to wait somewhere warm with a promise that he'd walk him over when it was time. That was the whole innocent chain of events that put a 78-year-old man in a torn coat in a plastic chair in the main terminal of the Bramwell Regional Airport. And that is where Officer Bryce Keller found him. Keller was 44, and he wore his contract security uniform like it was 4 stars. He wasn't a police officer, though he liked people to blur the line. He supervised the private guards the airport hired to watch the doors and move the loiterers along. And somewhere over the years, the small authority of that job had curdled him into something mean. Bryce Keller had learned that a uniform and a loud voice could make people obey, and he had come to enjoy obeying more than was good for a man's soul. He'd been watching the old man for 10 minutes. Torn coat, worn shoes, no luggage he could see, sitting too still. To Keller, it added up to one thing: a vagrant, a problem. Somebody is using his airport as a shelter. He walked over, thumbs in his belt, and stood over Isaiah, blocking the light. "You got a ticket?" Isaiah looked up, mild and polite. "No, sir. I'm not flying today. I'm just waiting on a—" "Then you can't be here." Keller said it fast, bored, like he'd said it 1,000 times. "Ticketed passengers only pass the doors. You need to move along, I understand," Isaiah said, and he started, slowly, to gather himself up, an old man's slow rise. "I was told to wait warm till my ride came. A young fella said he'd walk me over to the other building when—" "Yeah, I've heard it all before, pal." Keller's voice sharpened, and a few travelers glanced over. "The ride that's always coming, let me guess. Any minute now, right?" "Yes, sir," Isaiah said, without a flicker of anger. "Any minute now." "Sure." Keller looked him up and down, slow, and let a small, ugly smile show. "You know what I see? I see a guy who found himself a warm chair in a nice, clean airport and figured he'd spend the day. That coat's falling apart, man. When's the last time you had a shower? I got travelers here, families, and they don't need to be looking at." He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. The meaning sat in the air between them, ugly and plain. And here is the thing about Isaiah Coleman. He didn't rise to it. Not because he couldn't, but because 78 years and 31 of them in uniform had taught him that a man's dignity is the one thing no one can take unless he hands it over. And Isaiah Coleman was not handing his to a small man in a rented shirt. "Son," Isaiah said, quiet and steady, the voice that had once moved through the dark checking on his kids, "I'm not looking for any trouble. I served this country a long time. I'm just an old man waiting on a friend. Give me 20 minutes, and I'll be gone, and you'll never see me again." That should have been the end of it. But Bryce Keller heard I served this country, and instead of softening, something in him got worse. Because men like Keller cannot stand it when the person they've decided is beneath them turns out to have a claim to more respect than they do. It doesn't shame them. It threatens them. "Oh, you served," Keller said, and now there was a sneer in it, loud enough that the whole seating area could hear. "Everybody served. You know how many guys come through here with a sad story and an old coat, telling me they served. You got ID? You got papers? No? Didn't think so." He jerked his thumb toward the doors. "Out. I'm done being nice. This is a place of business, not a shelter, and I'm not going to tell you again. On your feet. Let's go." A few travelers looked away, embarrassed, uncomfortable, the way people do. Nobody stepped in. Nobody ever steps in. It is the oldest and saddest fact of a public place, that a person can be humiliated in the middle of a crowd, and the crowd will study its shoes. One man almost did. A middle-aged traveler, 2 rows over, set his coffee down and half rose, his face troubled. And then Keller shot him a look. That little flick of borrowed authority. "You want to be next?" And the man sat back down and picked his coffee up again and stared very hard at the floor. That's how it works. That's how it always works. It doesn't take much to keep a room silent. Just one loud man, and everyone's private hope that somebody else will be the one to speak. Nobody did. "Come on, let's move it." Keller actually reached out now and took the old man's elbow, steering him the way you'd steer a drunk, and something about a stranger's hand on Isaiah Coleman, a hand that had never once in 78 years been laid on him in disrespect, made a few of the watching travelers wince. Isaiah didn't pull away. He didn't make a scene. He simply looked down at the hand on his elbow and then up at the man it belonged to with an expression of such quiet, bottomless dignity that Keller, for half a second, faltered. Only half a second, I said, "Let's go." Saya gently removed his elbow from the man's grip. Not a jerk, just a slow, deliberate reclaiming of himself, and stood slowly. He didn't argue anymore. He'd measured the man and found the bottom of him, and he knew there was no reaching it. He gathered his old coat around him, and he lifted his chin, and he began the long, slow walk toward the sliding doors, and the cold beyond them. 78 years old, being marched out of a warm room into the winter for the crime of being poor and old and alone. And that walk, is the moment the story turns, because one person in that terminal did not study her shoes. Her name was Maya Ford, and she was 20 years old, and she pushed wheelchairs for a living. That was her actual job title, more or less, passenger assistance. Minimum wage, plus whatever tips the travelers remembered to give, which wasn't much. She spent her days ferrying the elderly and the injured and the frightened from curb to gate and gate to curb, and most people looked straight through her, the way people look through anyone in that kind of uniform. Maya knew exactly what it was to be invisible in a busy place. She wore the same coat 2 winters running. She knew. She'd been watching the whole thing from behind her empty wheelchair, 20 feet away, and her face had gone hot with a shame that wasn't even hers. Because Maya Ford had been raised by her grandfather, and her grandfather was a veteran, a quiet, proud old man who'd come home from his own war and worked 40 years and never asked anybody for anything, and who would have died before he let a stranger see him beg. Maya looked at the old man in the torn green coat being marched toward the cold, and she did not see a vagrant. She saw her grandfather. And Maya Ford was done studying her shoes. She left the wheelchair where it stood and crossed the terminal fast and caught up to Isaiah just short of the doors, and she stepped in beside him, gentle, and put a light hand on his arm. "Sir," she said, loud enough for Keller to hear, "why don't you let me help you?" "Come on," Keller bristled. "Ford, stay out of it. He's got no ticket. He's loitering. He's a veteran, Bryce." Maya turned on him, and there was a shake in her voice, but she didn't back down. "He told you he served. You don't get to throw a person out in the cold because his coat's got a hole in it. That's not the policy, and you know it. The policy is I decide who's a problem," Keller snapped. "And I've decided. You want to keep your little job, It's all right, miss." Isaiah's voice, quiet, cut gently through both of them. He looked down at this fierce young woman who'd appeared at his side out of nowhere, and something moved in his tired face. "It's all right. I don't want you getting in any trouble on my account. I'll just wait outside. The cold never killed me yet." He patted her hand where it rested on his arm. "But thank you. You have no idea. Thank you. It's a rare thing, a person who steps in, rarer than it ought to be. I'm not letting you wait outside." Maya said it flat, decided, and she said it the way you say a thing you're a little scared of but are going to do anyway. "You said your ride's coming to the General Aviation Building, right? I'll walk you over there myself. Right now. Come on, lean on me if you need to." And she started to walk him, slow, patient, matching his pace, toward the far doors, away from Keller, while the security guard sputtered behind them about jobs and policies and who she thought she was. They didn't make it to the other building, because that's when they all heard it. The roar. It started as a low rumble under the terminal's piped-in music, and it grew, and it grew until the tall glass windows of the Bramwell Regional Airport began to hum in their frames. Travelers turned, children pointed. Out on the gray runway, dropping fast out of a low winter sky, came an aircraft that did not belong at a sleepy regional field. Sleek and dark and unmistakably military, the kind of jet that carries people whose time is worth more than money. It touched down hard and clean and screamed down the runway and slowed and turned and began to taxi, not toward the distant General Aviation Building, but straight toward the main terminal, toward the glass. Toward them, Maya stopped walking. Isaiah stopped too. Even Keller, 20 feet back, had gone quiet. The jet rolled to a stop just off the terminal apron. A stairway dropped from its side, and a man came down those stairs fast, not waiting for it to fully settle. A tall man in a crisp uniform with a spray of stars on his shoulders that made a nearby gate agent gasp out loud. And behind him, more of them, aides and officers, a whole flowing knot of uniforms, moving with the urgency of people who have been worried. The doors of the terminal hissed open, and the cold air came in, and General Marcus Webb strode through them and stopped and scanned the crowd with the eyes of a man searching a battlefield for one specific face. And then he found it. He found the old man in the torn green coat and General Marcus Webb, 4 stars, a man who commanded tens of thousands, a man whom senators stood up for, stopped dead in the middle of that terminal, and his composed, powerful face simply broke, the way a face breaks when it sees something it loves and feared for. "Sergeant Major," he said, and his voice cracked right down the middle of it. "Oh, thank God, Sergeant Major." He crossed the floor, and in front of the whole frozen terminal, in front of the gaping travelers, and the pointing children, and the gate agents, and Maya Ford with her hand still on the old man's arm, and Bryce Keller standing there with the blood draining out of his face. General Marcus Webb, the highest-ranking man any of them would ever see in their lives, stopped in front of a 78-year-old man in a torn coat, and snapped to rigid, perfect attention, and brought his hand up in a salute, so sharp it could have cut the air. "Command Sergeant Major Isaiah Coleman," Webb said, loud now, his voice ringing off the glass, so that every soul in that terminal heard every word. "It is the honor of my life to salute you, as it has been every single day since you saved mine." The terminal was so silent you could hear the jet's engines ticking as they cooled. Isaiah's old eyes had filled. He brought his own hand up, slow, and returned the salute, and then, because they were long past salutes, the two of them, he opened his arms, and the 4-star general stepped into them like the 18-year-old boy he'd once been. And the two men held each other in the middle of the Bramwell Regional Airport, while the whole world watched and did not understand. But Maya Ford was beginning to understand. And Bryce Keller understood completely, and it was turning his stomach to ice. Webb pulled back, gripping the old man's shoulders, looking him over. "We couldn't reach you. Your phone was off. Of course your phone was off. You've had the same habits for 40 years. The car went to the wrong building, and then the driver said he'd left you at the main terminal. And He stopped. He looked, for the first time, at the old man's face, really looked, and he saw something there. "Sergeant Major, why are you standing by the doors? Why do you look like that? What happened?" And before Isaiah could wave it away, because of course he would have waved it away, he'd have said nothing. "Son, it's nothing. Let's go." Maya Ford spoke up. Her voice was shaking, but she said it. "Sir." "General, sir." She swallowed. "That man right there." She pointed at Keller. He threw him out, called him a vagrant, said he was trash because his coat was torn, was marching him out into the cold when you landed. I was trying to get him to safety. She lifted her chin, exactly the way the old man had lifted his. He wouldn't listen when I told him this man was a veteran. He said, "Everybody says that." The temperature in the terminal seemed to drop 10 degrees. General Marcus Webb turned, very slowly, and looked at Officer Bryce Keller. And Keller, who 20 minutes ago had been the biggest authority in the room, began desperately to talk. "General, sir, there's been a misunderstanding. He didn't have a ticket, and policy says I had no way of knowing who he. Sir, if you'd have known," Webb repeated, and his voice was terribly quiet now and terribly cold. "You'd have treated him with respect if you'd have known he mattered to someone like me. That's what you're telling me." He took a step toward Keller. "But you didn't know. So you looked at an old man in a worn coat, alone, hurting nobody, and you decided you could put him out in the cold like garbage because you thought he was nobody." Keller had no answer. "There isn't one. Let me tell you who that nobody is," General Webb said, and now he turned so that he was speaking to the whole terminal, the whole silent crowd, his voice carrying to every corner. "That man is Command Sergeant Major Isaiah Coleman, United States Army, retired, 31 years of service. And I am going to tell you people something about him, because he will never tell you himself." 26 years ago, General Webb said, standing in the middle of that hushed terminal, one hand still resting on the old man's shoulder, "I was an 18-year-old private in a valley on the other side of the world, and it was the worst night of my life. Nobody in that terminal moved. I won't tell you everything that happened that night. Some of it isn't for a room like this, but I'll tell you that I was done. I was finished. I was a scared kid a long way from home who had reached the absolute end of what he thought he could take, and I had decided that I couldn't do it anymore, that the world would be better off. I was sitting alone in the dark, and I had made up my mind." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not, and a big, quiet man sat down next to me. This man, Sergeant Major Coleman, he didn't yell at me. He didn't threaten to write me up. He didn't tell me to be a man and shake it off. Webb's jaw worked. He just sat down beside me in the dark, and he put one hand on my back, and he said, "I have heard these words in my head every hard day of my life since." He said, "I've got you. Just keep breathing. That's all you have to do right now. I'm right here. Just keep breathing." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman had started to cry. "He stayed with me all night," Webb said. "All night. He didn't leave me for 1 second. And in the morning, I was still here. And I was still here the next morning and the next, because every time it got dark, he found me, until I could find myself." He looked at the old man beside him. "I went home because of this man. I went to college because of this man. I got married, I held my children, I made general. I have had an entire life, an entire long, good life, because on the worst night of it, when I had decided to leave, one man decided to stay." He turned back to the crowd, and his voice rose. "And he didn't do it just for me. There are hundreds of us. Hundreds. All over this country, all over the world, there are grown men and women with children and careers and lives who are only here, who are only alive. Because at 18, at 19, at their lowest, this man sat down in the dark beside them and told them to keep breathing, and then refused to leave. We have a name for him, those of us he saved. We call him the anchor, because in the worst storm of our lives, he was the thing that held." He gestured back at the waiting jet. "There are 300 of us waiting for him right now, 2 states away. In a hall, we filled ourselves, on our own time, on our own dime, to honor a man who spent 31 years honoring us and never once asked for a thing in return. I flew here myself to bring him, because there was no one on this earth I would trust to carry the anchor home but me." His eyes swept the terminal and landed, hard, on Keller. "And I arrived to find one of you had thrown him in the cold like he was nothing." The silence was total, and then, slowly, something began to happen in that terminal. A man in a business suit near the window stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood and faced the old man and put his hand over his heart. Then a woman with a baby on her hip stood. Then an entire family. Then a cluster of college kids. Then the gate agents came out from behind their desks. One by one, and then in a rush, the whole terminal at the Bramwell Regional Airport rose to its feet for a 78-year-old man in a torn green coat. The same man they'd watched be marched toward the cold 20 minutes before and said nothing. They were saying something now. A whole room, standing, silent, hands over hearts, for the anchor. Isaiah Coleman stood in the middle of it, overwhelmed, his old face wet, and he did the only thing a humble man can do in the face of so much. He pressed his hand to his own heart, and he nodded to them, slow, all around the room. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, about Bryce Keller. There was no dramatic arrest. That's not how it went, and Isaiah wouldn't have wanted it, but there were consequences. Real ones, and they were swift. The general did not scream at Keller, in the end. He did something worse. He looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The look a commander gives a soldier who has disgraced the uniform. Except Keller had no uniform worth the name, and then he simply said, "You are not worth my anger, but you will answer for this." And he turned away, which for a man like Keller, who lived on being noticed, was the coldest cut of all. The whole thing had been captured by the airport's own cameras and by a dozen travelers' phones once the jet landed and people started filming. The video of a four-star general saluting an old man that a guard had just thrown out went everywhere, everywhere. By nightfall, the airport authority had seen it, and the airline had seen it, and the private security company that employed Bryce Keller had seen it, and the company that had once let Keller push people around because it was easier than dealing with complaints discovered. All at once, that the whole country was watching. Bryce Keller was suspended by the next morning and quietly let go within the week. The airport issued a public apology. But the part that mattered most to the people who knew the story wasn't the firing. It was smaller and heavier than that. It was that a great many people, watching that video, looked at the next old person in a worn coat a little differently. That, more than any pink slip, was justice. A small guard lost a job he'd abused, and a whole lot of strangers remembered how to see. But the story doesn't end with the villain. Warm stories never do, because General Marcus Webb walked Command Sergeant Major Isaiah Coleman out to that waiting military jet, slow, matching his pace, the way you walk with someone precious. And he flew him 2 states over to a hall filled with 300 of the people he had saved. And when the doors opened and the anchor walked in, torn coat and all, 300 grown men and women came to their feet and roared and then wept, and then lined up, one by one, for hours, just to shake his hand and tell him, some of them for the very first time, "I'm alive because of you. I never told you. I'm telling you now." Isaiah heard it 300 times that night. "I'm alive because of you." 300 times. From 300 lives. Each one a whole world. Each one carrying children and grandchildren and stories he would never fully know. The man who spent his whole life mending other people, quietly, asking nothing, spent one long, overwhelming, holy night learning exactly how much he had mended. Halfway through that line of 300, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s reached the front, and he was already crying before he got there, and he couldn't get his words out at all. He just held up a phone with a photograph on it. A young man in a cap and gown, grinning, the very picture of a life going right. Isaiah looked at the man's face, and something old and warm woke up in him. "Rabbit?" he whispered. The man broke completely. "You remember, Lord, you remember?" He wiped his face with the back of his hand, laughing and crying at once. "That's my boy, Sergeant Major. Graduated in the spring. First in our family to finish college." He turned the phone so Isaiah could see the young man better. "His name's Isaiah. I named him after the man who kept his daddy alive long enough to have him. He doesn't even know he's named after a hero. He just thinks it's a good, strong name. Rabbit's voice cracked to nothing. It's the best name I know. Isaiah Coleman took that man's face in both his old hands, the way Mama Zell used to, and pressed their foreheads together. And neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some things are too big for words and only fit in silence. Still here, the old man finally whispered. Both of us, that's the whole victory. And the loneliness, the 4 years of the echoing house, the 2 cups set out by habit, the empty chair, his family would not let it stand. They had talked about it, his soldiers, before he ever arrived. They had a plan for the anchor, and it wasn't a plaque or a check. It was a promise that he would never spend another holiday alone, that there would always, always be a bunk for him, a table with his name on it, a phone that answered on the first ring. They set up a rotation, half joking and entirely serious, a schedule of visits and calls, and Sunday dinners stretching out over the years, because the man who never left anyone was not, they had decided, going to be left. Not now, not ever. You stayed for us, Sergeant Major, Webb told him quietly that night as the hall emptied. For 31 years you stayed. It's our turn now. We've got you. You just keep breathing, old man. We're not going anywhere. Isaiah Coleman put his face in his hands and wept like a child and was held. And Maya Ford. Don't think for a second the old man forgot Maya Ford. He asked about her the very next morning. The young woman who'd stepped in when nobody else would, who'd been ready to lose her job to walk a stranger to safety. He learned that she pushed wheelchairs for minimum wage, that she'd been raised by her veteran grandfather, that she dreamed of nursing school and had shelved the dream because dreams cost money she didn't have. Isaiah, who had never in his life asked for a single thing for himself, made one phone call, and it turned out that a man loved by 300 people, several of them powerful, does not have to ask twice. A fund was set up, quietly, the way Isaiah did everything, to put Maya Ford through nursing school, all of it, tuition, books, a stipend so she could quit the wheelchairs and study. There was one condition attached, and it was pure Isaiah Coleman, that someday, when she was a nurse, on some hard night, she'd find the most frightened person on her ward, and she'd sit down beside them, and she'd stay. Maya read that condition and cried in a wheelchair assistant's break room. And then she called the number, and the old man answered on the first ring, the way he now always would. "Why me?" she asked him. "You didn't even know me. Why would you do all this for me?" And Isaiah Coleman, 78 years old, in a torn green coat with the last of his wife's thread in the hem, gave her the only answer he'd ever had. The whole reason he'd ever been down here, according to a small old woman on a porch in Sweet Gum a lifetime ago. "Because you stepped in when it was hard, baby," he said. "You looked at somebody the world had stopped seeing, and you stayed. That's the whole job. That's the whole reason we're down here." She could hear the smile in his voice. "You mended me a little that day by those doors, so now it's my turn to mend you back. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. We just keep mending each other, all the way down the line." Maya Ford became a nurse, and on her very first hard night on the ward, she found the most frightened patient in her care, an old man, alone, terrified, and she pulled up a chair and she sat down beside him, and she took his hand. "I've got you," she told him softly. "Just keep breathing. I'm right here." The line goes on. That's the thing about a man like Isaiah Coleman. The mending never stops. It just finds new hands. So let me leave you with this. That old man in the torn coat was the most decorated thing a person can be. Not in medals, but in lives. Hundreds of them. And a guard looked right at him and saw garbage because his coat had a hole in it. How many Isaiahs have you walked past? The quiet old man on the bus. The woman alone at the diner counter. The person the whole room has stopped seeing. What are they carrying that you'll never know? If this story moved you, do 3 things right now. Drop a comment and tell me about the person in your life who was your anchor, who stayed when it was hard. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that you never, ever know who you're really looking at, and subscribe and turn on notifications so the next story finds you, because the torn coat is never the story. The story is always the thread inside it and whose hands did the mending.